last years of the 19th century, that human affairs were being watched from the timeless worlds of space. No one could have dreamed we were being scrutinized as someone with a microscope studies creatures that swarm and multiply in a drop of water. Few men even considered the possibility of life on other planets. And yet, across the gulf of space, minds immeasurably superior to ours regarded this Earth with envious eyes. And slowly and surely, they drew their plans against us.
Broadcasting live
from a tiny studio somewhere in North America.
This is Dark Matters Radio Live. And now I give you your host,
the silverback of ufology.
Here's Don Ecker.
And welcome, ladies and gentlemen, back to another edition of Dark Matters Radio. And of course, DMR is brought to you courtesy of KGRA Radio, your contact point to the paranormal. Now, tonight, what is it? 3 weeks, 4 weeks, 5 weeks? Hell, I don't know anymore, but we're under assault. Yep, that damned coronavirus. The Mexican beer virus is still assaulting us from one end of the country to the other. Now, I got to tell you, I am sick to death of hearing about corona or COVID-19, whatever the hell their label they're putting on it. But the bottom line is, this is your respite away from all that crap, at least for the next 2 hours. Now, I've got a virus suggestion for you. If you are as sick of hearing about that crap as I am, this is what I suggest. Find yourself the rendition of Basil Polidoris's movie score for Conan the Barbarian. You know, the original, the one with Schwarzenegger. I just played it before the damn show started tonight through my headphones. I cranked it up, and as I told my guest and Skywatcher, the producer, by God, I'm ready to grab a broadsword, a shield, and go look for a barbarian. And speaking of my guest, I am pleased to announce tonight that coming back, as he promised he would, Mr. Micah Hanks, who is the original and only host of the Gralien Report, heard right here on KGRA. Now, if you haven't listened to the Gralien Report, I strongly suggest you tune in. All Micah's archives are up. And if you're wondering what the hell it's all about, well, it takes a slash at science, unexplained phenomena, history, and Micah and I, in the shows that we've done in the past, we've proven that extensively, and science fiction and other news from around the world. And with that being said, Micah, a hearty welcome. Welcome back to DMR. How in the world have you been?
I am doing so well, in fact, in light of current events, that I'm otherworldly, Don. So glad to be right here on the program with you tonight, my man.
Well, excellent. Now, I got to tell you, I just received from a publisher a book that I am currently devouring by a guy by the name of Tom Willis. Do you know him?
Tom Willis. The name rings a bell, yeah.
Hidden History. And it's going into all those areas, Micah, that I got to tell you, I crave. The origins of the human race, our distant cousins and ancestors from that period of time, the world's first civilizations that got together, pre-diluvial, of course, and a lot of other things in that area. And I know that's something that kind of Twitter pates you too, if I'm not mistaken.
Yeah, absolutely. You know, I've long been fascinated with the mystery of human origins, and that, of course, has driven me toward getting more involved in actual archaeological research in the last few years. And again, I feel that maybe the best thing I can do in that regard is lending my blood, sweat, and tears with trowel in hand while volunteering on a lot of excavation sites here in the Southeast, which I was doing just a couple of weeks ago. And before kind of all the coronavirus stuff was really making news, we were all sneezing and coughing for very different reasons in South Carolina. There's a lot of pollen and dust in the air. So, yeah, that's archaeology at its finest. But, yeah, you know, like a lot of people, I started out reading about, you know, the lost civilizations and a lot of these concepts. You know, some of those ideas I think that there is some merit to. But, of course, getting involved in real archaeology, you kind of realize that a lot of those ideas are worlds apart. And that's been maybe one of the most interesting things for me.
Well, that may be true until a number of years ago when a farmer stumbled over a site that was beyond imagining, going back at least 11,000 years, Göbekli Tepe, and that kind of rewrote history on the turning of a pin, didn't it?
Yeah, it really did. Göbekli Tepe is so enigmatic for a number of reasons. You think, for instance, about Stonehenge and, you know, sites that are very famous and have been for a long time and which have captured our imagination. And then you look at Göbekli Tepe, which, again, this is a site that is thousands of years older than the best known and the most well-built megalithic sites like Stonehenge and in other parts of the world. And yet, look at the intricacy of the art. Look at the high relief art forms that appear on these pillars. Look at the symbolism. You know, again, look at also the solar alignment. So the people who built Göbekli Tepe quite obviously were looking at the sky and were aware of the change of the seasons and the way that the stars coincide with this. There are all of those aspects of archaeoastronomy, very, very sophisticated art, and also principles of structure at Göbekli Tepe that far predate anything that we expected. And this, again, from a pre-agricultural, pre-pottery, presumably hunter-gatherer society. Yeah, Göbekli Tepe turned the world upside down with its discovery.
Well, you know, golly, how long's it been? It's been about a year or so. I had a lady archaeologist on the program, Dr. Heather Lynn, and I was going to have her back before she basically dropped off the radar. But in her field, and she is a studied academic, in her field, she really isn't popular in a number of mainstream areas, but be that as it may, we had a really rousing chat when she was on the show. And that, as a matter of fact, was one of the topics we hit, Micah, Göbekli Tepe. And she was rattling off figures and dates, etc., about that site. And I got to tell you, I got all excited. And then she said something, and I'm paraphrasing, of course, along the lines of, and here was all this architecture and all of these intricately carved stone columns, etc. And still, even at this point, not quite probably 25% of that area has even been excavated. Now, they have a lot of stuff over there that they basically uncovered. And if she's correct, that only maybe 25% has been cleared, that means that site is one hell of a lot bigger than everybody figured. And anyway, she's talking about, well, and here it was 11,000 years ago. Nobody knew it was there. And how did that happen? How did that become, how did that become there? I mean, who put it there? Does anybody really believe that basically cavemen came out of caves and built that. And I said something almost in passing, and I said, well, I think they were refugees. And suddenly, Micah, she got excited. She said, that's right, that's what I'm talking about. Well, okay, refugees from where? Well, maybe that mythical site, Atlantis, after the flood. These were survivors. And that always kind of stuck with me. What do you think?
Well, that's an idea that has really, I think, attracted a lot of people to the fields of history and archaeology. Was there a civilization prior to the end of the last ice age, and is there evidence for it? Now, Göbekli Tepe is interesting in that regard. And I should note, by the way, that, there are a lot of credentialed archaeologists and historians who have gotten into the field and become academics. They were drawn to that prospect as well. The idea that, again, refugees from Atlantis or something along those lines might account for the very sudden rise of civilization in places like Egypt. Egypt, of course, being foremost in terms of their attention prior to the discovery of sites like Göbekli Tepe, because it was the most apparent and has been for the longest time. It's hard to miss, monuments on scale with the pyramids at Giza or the Sphinx. Now, more on Egypt here in a moment, but again, that idea that, high civilization in the ancient world thousands of years ago comes to pass and rises seemingly out of nowhere has compelled a lot of researchers and scientists. Although the general attitude among academics is that it seems unlikely and there isn't enough evidence to support the idea of said lost civilization. That was especially the case prior to the discovery of Göbekli Tepe. And so there is a bit of a disconnect in terms of people trying to understand, okay, well, with Göbekli Tepe, what's the big deal? How is this in any way evidence of a lost civilization? We're not looking at, advanced, concepts of architecture on par with the pyramids or anything at Göbekli Tepe. What's the big deal about that site? Well, there are a few things that are noteworthy. One, of course, is the fact that, as many have pointed out, Göbekli Tepe, with the sophistication not only of the structure itself, but also the art, and a few other aspects of Göbekli Tepe, which we can get into in a moment. This also having to do with the very unique worshipful or cult aspect that has been asserted by researchers only in recent years. This was one of the top stories, I believe, that Smithsonian Mag and Archaeology magazine listed for the year of 2018, if memory serves. But the fact that Göbekli Tepe is so sophisticated, but thousands of years in advance of what was expected for people in that stage in history, in that part of the world, and we're talking, of course, about Anatolia, Turkey, this is what I think really caused people to say, look, if we've got sites like Göbekli Tepe, does this mean that not only was there this fascinating development in the ancient world, in modern-day Turkey, that was occurring there, could it also be that there were more advanced things going on in other parts of the world? And could some of the technological principles that we see at places like Göbekli Tepe have been applied later, and maybe even shortly thereafter at other locations? Now, a really interesting one to me is the prospect that has long been held. It's been the contention of Robert Schoch, the geologist of Boston University, for a number of years. I know Robert pretty well, and in fact actually lent my pipes to an audiobook version of the book that he co-authored with Robert Bauval, Origins of the Sphinx. I actually narrated their audiobook of that fantastic book, and I have to recommend it to everybody because that book is a very unique perspective coming from a structural engineering perspective of Robert Bauval, and then from a geological perspective of Robert Schoch, that makes the case that, and also a lot of historical detective work, that suggests that there is a case to be made that maybe the Sphinx predates many of the other monuments there at Giza. Now, it had originally been Robert Schoch's contention that it was, maybe a few thousand years, maybe just a few hundred years, but nonetheless, it was older than most of the other structures there at Giza. In more recent years, he has said, look, I pushed this all the way back to closer to the end of the last ice age. And of course, at the outset, I was much more conservative with my suppositions about that. But when we look at sites like Göbekli Tepe, we are seeing artistic and also architectural structures on par with the kinds of technology that would have been implemented with the carving and the shaping of the Sphinx in the ancient world. He says it's no longer purely speculation to say that people could have done that long ago. And in fact, with Göbekli Tepe, we now have evidence that that level of sophistication did exist among these quote-unquote primitive people, which really says a lot about how primitive they were, in my opinion.
Well, all around the world also, Micah, are megalithic sites, even here in the North American continent, megalithic sites that actually have no real foundation on who, what, where, and when they were even placed there. And this is back in your area of the country. And I'm sorry, I don't remember the correct name, but the Great Serpentine snake figure that has been discovered back there, actually, I guess, quite a while ago. But I'm sure you know what I'm referring to, yes?
Yes, the Great Serpent Mound of Ohio, probably.
There you go. There you go. And do we really believe that Paleo Indians created that? Or perhaps someone else?
Right. Now, okay, in my opinion, I'll just tell you, full disclosure, and by the way, I wish I could tell everybody, go to the Great Serpent Mound. You've got to see it. I really think people do, but with the current coronavirus pandemic, I believe that the Serpent Mound is actually closed with regard to the stay-at-home measures that are being implemented in a lot of counties, municipalities, et cetera. So hopefully when a lot of this situation blows over, people can get out there and see it. Now, I've been to the Great Serpent Mound, and in fact, I have spoken to a number of leading archaeologists who have done work there. And if there's one weapon I think I can arm myself here with in relation to discussing this, that would have to be radiocarbon dates. And there are some differences in opinion about how old the Great Serpent Mound is. But in my opinion, Don, all of the evidence actually points back to around between maybe 800 BC and I'd say as far back maybe as 1650. But again, we're looking at either the Adena culture or the Fort Ancient culture of Ohio that likely built that. And there are a number of reasons why we can draw this conclusion. First and foremost, again, the serpent was prevalent, especially during the Mississippian period among Native American, North American Indian cultures. We also have a recognized Adena culture mound directly adjacent to the Great Serpent Mound, which is why, in the opinion of Dr. Bradley Lepper of the Ohio History Connection, it's probably an Adena structure. But some have also said that, well, again, and he has said, and I've spoken with him, I asked him about this, that he is willing to look at other alternatives because, again, the other opinion is that it was a different culture that came at a slightly different time, the Fort Ancient culture that would have constructed the Great Serpent Mound. But again, to me, that's not exactly going all the way back to Paleo-Indian periods. It would have to be much older for it to be that old. Now, many would say, well, how do you know it's that recent then, and why is it, remarkable if it is a more recent construction? Well, again, the radiocarbon dates that we have that have been extracted during the excavations, and of course, one of the problems with excavating something like Great Serpent Mound and why it hasn't been excavated more is because archaeology is by nature an intrusive process. When you go in there and you start removing dirt from a landmark and a mound, an effigy mound, and a historical landmark unlike any other, not just in North America, but anywhere in the world. There are other serpent effigies, none quite like the Great Serpent Mound. When you go in there and start cutting away and removing dirt, what are you doing? You're destroying parts of this remarkable landmark. So what we need to do is preserve it. And so in recent years, more studies have been actually conducted utilizing ground-penetrating radar and similar non-invasive technological approaches. But from what we have been able to extract from lower levels of the mound, organic matter that has been radiocarbon datable clearly shows us that this is not an ancient structure. It doesn't go all the way back to, the times of lost, fabled Atlantis. I'd love to be able to tell you that, but all the scientific evidence suggests that we're looking at either an Adena cultural structure or a Fort Ancient culture, or it could be that one of the earlier groups that constructed that this site was perhaps also kind of maintained, and that the later cultures became tenants. And so some of the evidence that is suggestive that more recent construction and also the upkeep and maintenance of that site may have simply been that they were actually curators of. They were kind of those who restored and who upkept that site. Because think of it like this. You or I were walking through the woods. We find an ancient structure that is fascinating to us, and it's all, dusty and it's covered in leaves and things. And we say, this is remarkable. People need to see this. So we clean it off. We start, moving sticks, leaves, brush, and things out of the way. And we basically get it back into shape. It's very possible that ancient cultures did the same thing. If an earlier group built something, sure, they would have probably maintained and upkept and saw that, and saw that as a sacred site as well. I don't think, though, that based on the radiocarbon dates from the lowest levels that are, I think, fairly indicative of when this structure was actually built, that it goes much further back. Again, we're looking at Adena or Fort Ancient, I believe. Go ahead.
Let me interject here. Now, recently, and I'm talking in the last few months, I read an article concerning the Maya coming out of Central America. The Maya, of course, there are a lot of questions about what happened to that entire civilization. There are some that believe that the Maya, for whatever reason, emigrated up here to what is now North America. But one of the myths and the gods that those indigenous people down there worshipped was a god by the name of Quetzalcoatl. Now, Quetzalcoatl has always been described as a flying serpent. Now, in your learned opinion, could there be any correlation between that mound in Ohio and Quetzalcoatl?
In my opinion, I don't know if I would call it learned. I'm someone who reads a lot, and I talk to all the experts who are far more qualified than I am, Don. But in my opinion, yeah. And I'll tell you why. Now, I don't know that this is necessarily an opinion that is shared by those who are considered experts on the mound. And so with respect to Dr. Lepper, Dr. Jared Burks, who I spoke with just a few months ago actually about this, and who's conducted some fantastic research up there in conjunction with the Ohio History Connection at the Serpent Mound. But in my opinion, it is very curious that we have the prevalence of the serpent motif throughout so many North American and also certain South American indigenous groups. If we go, of course, to sites like Teotihuacan, we see similar renditions of a winged serpent. I mean, again, that is very reminiscent of a very prevalent motif that appears in the Mississippian culture here in North America. And in the United States specifically, a number of different sites that are still preserved in many of them national parks today. And so, in my opinion, and in fact, I did speak with one expert about this, which I'll get to in a moment, but the curious prevalence of that, specifically a winged serpent, almost chimeric kind of serpent with a rattlesnake tail often, but also with wings, sometimes with bird's feet, sometimes even with deer antlers or horns. The prevalence of that motif throughout all these cultures that allegedly were not in contact with one another was very curious. Now, I had a great opportunity a while back, Don, to talk with Dr. Robert Carballo, also of Boston University, who has led excavations at Teotihuacan probably for, years. And in fact, I think they were just entering a new season last year when I spoke with him. And I asked him about that. I said, is that a completely just coincidental that we see this continuity, or is there something more to this? And the long story short, I believe we've got a break coming up here, but he had said to me, listen, we can't confirm that is a motif that was shared between these groups and that they had interactions with one another. But what the archaeological evidence clearly says is that obsidian from Mesoamerica has been found at sites like the Spiro Mound in Oklahoma. We've also found cocoa at Chaco Canyon, which also came from Mesoamerica. Clearly, there was trade between these groups that were contemporaneous with one another. It is not impossible that they also shared certain aspects of their culture, their beliefs, and even their art. And so maybe there is more of a case to be made for those connections, in my opinion.
Good. And I have a question that I'm going to bounce off you when we come back from break. Ladies and gentlemen, this is Dark Matters Radio. Tonight, my very special guest and one of my favorites, Mr. Micah Hanks, who is the host of the Gralien Report, heard right here on KGRA. Every time Mike has been on, we have had, in my opinion, at any rate, an absolutely sterling, outstanding discussion. And we got more coming up when we get back, so stick around.
Nancy Vernon here with Ozark Mountain Publishing, coming to you from the Ozark Mountains of Northwest Arkansas. We are a publisher of New Age, metaphysical, spiritual, nonfiction books, as well as digital downloads, DVDs, and audiobooks. This is also the home of all of Dolores Cannon's titles. The company was founded in 1992 and has been bringing to you a varied selection of titles covering many different subjects. This year, we have added a new imprint to our company, Big Sandy Press. They will be publishing titles from the genres of historical fiction and nonfiction, paranormal fiction, and more. So be sure to visit our website, ozarkmt.com, and explore all the new and exciting authors and titles coming your way.
For more information about Ozark Mountain Publishing or their events, call 800-935-0045. That's 800-935-0045, or visit their website at ozarkmt.com. That's ozarkmt.com.
Okay, nurse, let's get this man to the ER stat.
Right away, doctor.
We see this every day. Heart attack or angina pain due to blocked and clogged arteries. Chelation can remove obstructions or blockages from arteries and help avoid painful and expensive surgery. Now there's Angioprim. It's a liquid oral chelation product that you take with juice. You start to feel the results fast. Angioprim increases blood flow all over the body, and that means more energy and strength to take on the day with less aches and pains. 60 years of research has gone into chelation, and Angioprim is the result. A safe and easy way to unblock your veins and arteries from buildup that slow circulation.
Paging Dr. Jones. Please report to the emergency room right away.
Log on now to angioprim.com. That's ANGIOPRIM.com. Or to speak with a trained consultant. Give Angioprim a call at 954-882-7221. That's 954-882-7221.
Hey, is that a new music app?
Yeah, check it out. Surfer Music Discovery. It links to thousands of online stations, but the twist is you see the song names and artists that are now playing live.
That's different. No guessing. Looks like a waterfall of music.
So many formats. Rock, oldies, country, R&B, jazz, and a whole lot more.
How's that spelled?
Surfer. S-U-R-F-R.
Is it expensive?
It's free. No need to sign up or sign in.
Get the Surfer Music app free from Google Play or the App Store.
Are you intrigued by Paranormal Talk Radio? You'll love the new Paranormal Radio app from TalkStream Live. You'll find a great selection of talk shows covering UFOs, ghosts, strange phenomena, and much more. Download the Paranormal Radio app now and start listening to the very best in paranormal talk entertainment, including the network you're listening to right now. The Paranormal Radio app, free in Google Play and the iOS App Store.
Mainstream media's most wanted. KGRAradio.com.
And we are back with my guest, Mr. Micah Hanks. Micah, once again, it is a distinct pleasure to have you here. Look, I said before we went to the break that I had a question I wanted to bounce off you, but let me set it up first. Now, this is something, ladies and gentlemen, that many people today may not even realize. I mean, the state of our academic institutions are in such a state of disrepair, in my opinion, okay, that they're not actually teaching real history anymore. As a side note, this was an aspect when I was in college that I absolutely was crazy nuts about, especially ancient history. Now, there was a group of seafarers going back over 3,000 years ago called the Phoenicians. And these people, which absolutely came out of the Middle East, these people were known to seafare all around the globe. There have been reports of artifacts that have been found that were traced to the Phoenicians in South America. I don't know about Central America, although I would imagine they're there also, and even as far north as North America. Now, the records are absolutely bare when it comes to voyages like that, and there are many in the academic community that will deny that any of those folks ever even got over here. But I think they're tilting at windmills, because I don't believe they've given these people the credit that they deserve. But why do I mention all this? Well, I'll tell you. In Egypt, which has always been the go-to spot for archaeology historians and so forth. I mean, we're talking about a civilization that lasted over 3,000 years. And there's so much about the Egyptians, no matter how much we think we know, we don't. But mummies have been discovered after scientific testing with traces of tobacco and cocaine in them. Now, why would that be surprising? Well, because tobacco and cocaine were not native to that part of the world, but they were in this part of the world, in North and South America. The cocoa leaves, the tobacco plants that the Native Americans used, etc. Now, you've got to ask yourself if that's true. And if there was no commerce, how did tobacco and cocaine get to Egypt? And that, Micah, is my question. Tell us what you think.
Well, sir, first of all, I've got to address a terrible problem, I think, that many archaeologists actually point out about archaeology. And although I think that this sort of taboo is somewhat lessening in recent years, and there have been some studies that have helped with this, it has long been a contention among many in the archaeological community that there were no ancient mariners. Obviously we know that there were people who were sailing in ancient times. We know that the Phoenicians, of course, were quite adept at sailing. At times, so were also the Egyptians that you mentioned, also the Greeks. But when we go way back, when we go tens of thousands of years back, most would say, well, but there's no evidence really that there were boats being utilized, and to suppose that there had been people traversing the Atlantic or the Pacific Ocean or major waterways, it's a bit of a stretch. But here's the conundrum. When we look at presumably at some point, there had to be a traversing of the ocean in order to settle and populate Australia. And so the evidence seems to strongly indicate that not only have humans been sailing for quite a long time, but there also has been some accumulation of anthropological evidence suggestive of the fact that ancient archaic human ancestors, cousins actually more like Homo erectus, perhaps Neanderthals, maybe even the enigmatic Denisovans, and other hominins as yet unrecognized in the fossil record, but which are beginning to turn up in modern genomic studies, DNA studies of mitochondrial DNA among existent modern human groups in different parts of the world. Quite obviously, there were people who were sailing. And for my own part, I've looked at this, again, what Dr. James Adovasio, who is an archaeologist who I have tremendous respect for, and he has referred to it as, again, this nonsensical kind of almost aversion to the idea that watercraft could have been used by ancient people in the ancient world. He says it's such a nonsensical attitude that people have, whereas quite obviously they must have been getting around utilizing watercraft. I simply say this. If you look at what happens when you toss a twig on a lake or the surface of a pond, when you watch what wood does, it floats. It wouldn't have taken a whole lot for ancient cultures to put two and two together. We always undermine, well, they couldn't have built anything as advanced as Göbekli Tepe until we find Göbekli Tepe, which isn't, in truth, even the oldest site of its kind. Now we've also got sites like Bonkuklu Tarla, also there in Turkey, which predates Göbekli Tepe. Now I think Göbekli Tepe will maintain its presence as sort of the reigning enigmatic ancient site, but my point is we always downplay the efficacy and the capabilities of ancient humans until we find something remarkable that reshapes our entire thinking of what they were capable of. As far as people getting around the ancient world, in terms of questions like, how do we find evidence of cocaine and tobacco and things in ancient Egypt? And was there actual transatlantic trade and was there exploration on that scale in the ancient world? That's comparatively recent compared to looking at archaic human ancestors and Paleo-Indian groups coming into North America. And now, on that note, I should also quickly point out that there are also theories that the idea of the land bridge across the Bering Land Bridge, that may not have had to be the only way that people were actually coming into North America. They might have used watercraft and bounced along the coastlines. In fact, it's not impossible either that certain ancient Paleolithic groups from parts of Europe might have done the same thing and come across a northerly passage across the Atlantic into the northeastern Americas as well.
You read my mind, because I was going to mention that, damn it.
Yeah, and we'll get to that in a moment. I'll just add this about the Phoenicians. Again, to look at comparatively recent civilizations that were obviously very sophisticated with their architecture, with their art, with a lot of, even with astronomy and things along these lines. And when we look at enigmatic, out-of-place artifacts, if you want to call them that, like the Antikythera mechanism, I mean, quite obviously they had a degree of technological sophistication we never would have attributed to those cultures prior to those discoveries. It's not impossible that there was a lot more getting around, but I've got to tell you this very unique story. Okay, so Don, I don't know if you know this, but back in December, I actually went to Lisbon, Portugal. And after spending a number of days with my friend Jan there in Lisboa, we actually flew out to the Azores. I've long been fascinated with the Azores because I think going all the way back to Ignatius Donnelly in the 1800s, he had suggested that this might have been the remnants of Atlantis. Now, whether or not that's the case, there's a very unique story about a little island on the northwestern corner of the Azores island chain, which unfortunately, while I was there, I wasn't able to get out there. But this is the island of Corfu. And going back to the middle 1700s, there's a very weird story about something that was found there on Corfu. And the source of the information for this actually was a publication from 1778 that had been published by the Royal Society of Sciences and Letters in Gothenburg. Johann Podolin was the author. He was a Portuguese-born Swede. And I want to reference the Wikipedia page on this very briefly just to get the gist of the story across here. In 1761, he had met in Madrid the historian and numismatist Enrique Flores, who gave him 9 coins that were of Carthaginian origin. All right, they were from Carthage. However, these, he said, came not from Carthage directly, but that they had been discovered in a hoard that had been found in 1749 in a black pot or a vase that had been washed out of the foundations of a building by a storm. And so I was able to find a facsimile of the old account from Podolin. And I actually, while I was in the Azores, we had beautiful internet connection staying at a little inn that we were at called the Garupas Inn. I was actually working on a rough translation utilizing translation software, and the gist of the story goes like this, that basically a storm had washed through and washed out a portion of the beach, and that they'd found this little pot there on the beach. And in it were all of these Carthaginian coins on Corfu, a volcanic island out there in the Azores, where, interestingly, the president of Portugal, I believe, spent Christmas just to go out there and kind of, be with the common folks out there on the islands. But for there to have been Carthaginian coins in a little pot on that island would seem to indicate that, again, there would had to have been sailors from the old world who had made their way out there. What's equally fascinating, Don, is that there are old maps and portolans that also depict basically a man, they say, who was dressed in Moorish garb, and that he's pointing off to the west. And some believe that that had been based on the fact that there had at one time actually been a statue on Corfu. Now, there's no evidence of that statue to this day, but the legends tell that old sailors said that they believed that there had been a statue out there on that island that predated, going back, at least decades, possibly centuries, that someone had put out there on this island with this man pointing off to the west. And so the implication seems to be that, yes, some of the ancient mariners of the old world absolutely could have made their way out there, at least to the Azores. The question, of course, is, could they have kept sailing west? Would they have gone on? And if they did, would they have found America?
Absolutely. And that brought to mind, while you were giving me that fascinating story, something that happened much more recently in the 19th century. I believe, I'm going strictly by memory now.
Sure.
I believe it involved Chief Joseph. And if I'm correct, he was Nez Perce. But at any rate, out of Idaho, he had a clay tablet that had been passed down from his family, his ancestors, that was in essence and actually from Mesopotamia, from the ancient land of Sumer. Are you familiar with that?
I am not actually.
Well, now, obviously, the first question that comes to mind, Sumer, my God, we're talking about a civilization that sprang up on the plains of Mesopotamia 6,000 years ago, that by all appearances was already formed. They had the arts of government, the arts of astronomy, writing, agriculture, city planning, etc. I mean, you know, Sumer has always been one of those enigmas out of history. But this brought something else to mind, Micah. And this is even from the Judeo-Christian Bible, okay? Talking about the city of Jericho. Now, everybody has heard about Jericho. I mean, that's a very, very famous ancient city. But it is a city with its roots going back 9,000 years. So here was a fully formed civic area with government, with people, with, citizens, military forces, whatever it took to maintain that city. But it was there for 9,000 years. Now, you very seldom hear anybody refer to Jericho. And to me, that's always been a mystery. What do you think?
Yeah, and again, I'm no expert on Jericho, but if my memory serves, again, there had been hunter-gatherer outposts that would have served, I guess, is what you might call the prehistoric vestiges of what would become a city that probably went back even further than 9,000 years. I mean, I think we're looking at more like 10,000 years, maybe going right up to what is known today as the Younger Dryas, a very enigmatic period in history, which I've spent a lot of time both in the field and also in books and papers studying.
Well, that's a demarcation line. Younger Dryas is a total demarcation line.
Right. Yeah. And what I think many are looking at it as being now is a turning. In fact, actually, yesterday I just spoke with a former president of the Archaeological Institute of America, Dr. Andrew Moore, who is, talk about a fascinating guy. He has done work in Croatia, in all kinds of different countries, Greece. Most recently, he has been a co-author on a paper in Syria that's looking at evidence of not only the Younger Dryas, but also impact proxies that he has said. And this, again, he was excavating this site. It's called Abu Huraira. This is not related to Jericho, so I want to make a distinction. But since we're talking about the Dryas, I bring it into the conversation here. He says that there, and having begun excavations there between 1972 and 1973, he makes the argument that there is strong evidence for impact proxies that cannot be there, irreconcilable with any other forces of nature other than an impact strike. And he is actually one of a number of researchers who are now proposing the idea that a comet fragment, likely an airburst, but possibly also some impact locations around the globe coincident with this event contributed, and that this is what we know as the Younger Dryas impact hypothesis. But yes, the Jericho site that you're talking about goes right back to, at very least, again, actually, if it's 10,000 BCE, we're talking about immediately following the Younger Dryas period that we're talking about here. And so, yeah, it goes way back.
Well, let me throw this at you. Now, practically every civilization on the planet, every culture of human beings, somewhere in their past, have a flood myth. Okay? The flood myth in the Judeo-Christian Bible originally emanated from Sumer. Now, the father of all the Jews in the planet, Abraham, was said to come out of the city of Ur in the Chaldees. This was a part of Sumeria. And I can't even begin right now to pronounce the version of Noah that they talked about. It was some, well, I'm not going to try because I would only butcher it. But much of what began as the Jewish tradition emanated with Abraham. Now, with that being said, when the Younger Dryas began, something unimaginable happened to planet Earth. There's no doubt about that. Within a very short geological time, all the ice sheets that at that point covered half of North America disappeared. They melted, they receded. The oceans rose. In some accounts, more than 200 feet, perhaps as much as 400 feet. The oceans of the planet rose. The conveyor that circulates, that causes Europe to warm up, I forget the exact name of the conveyor, but it's currents that run cold and warm water, were knocked out of commission. We went once again into a mini ice age as a result of whatever it was that happened. Now, in Greenland, Micah, and I'm sure you're already aware of this, a crater was discovered under the ice in over 100 miles of diameter. Graham Hancock believes that a comet fragmented, and we were struck with 7 or 8, perhaps 9 fragments of this exploding comet, the one that created that tremendous crater, with beliefs that here in North America, other fragments from that hit. Now, at that time, of course, the ice sheets, in some places up to 2 miles in depth, 2 miles of ice, think about that. And they would have absorbed these cometary fragments, so we would have a hard time finding craters today. But whatever it was, basically reset the planet back to day one. Now, also in that time, today, it's a vast desert. But the Sahara at one time was a rich, verdant Greenland, okay, with herds of animals, human beings, God knows what all were there, that basically disappeared, relatively speaking, in the blink of an eye. So I don't think there's any argument, Micah, that something of tremendous import happened here.
Oh, yes. And yet many have continued to argue it, my friend. I'll back up just a little. When I first became interested in the idea of the Younger Dryas, because again, that does not necessarily refer to an impact in and of itself. The Younger Dryas is simply a period of extreme cold reversal that occurs as we are exiting the last ice age of the Pleistocene. You were mentioning the disruption of the ocean currents. You're absolutely spot on. That's called thermohaline currents. What the general theory about the Younger Dryas had been prior to this impact theory had been the idea that as a natural process of deglaciation, and again, if we talk about ice ages, what causes ice ages? If we go all the way back to the 1920s, there was a guy named Milutin Milankovitch, and he had calculated based on 3 factors, which I believe, eccentricity, he was talking about axial tilt and then precession. Those are the 3 factors that he uses to calculate the periodicity of cold and warm trends, in other words, glacial and interglacial periods that overtake the Earth. And at various times throughout Earth, geologists know that there was so much ice accumulation all over the planet that there's actually a theory called, appropriately enough, snowball Earth, where the entire planet or most of it would have been completely encased in ice. Fortunately, we're not in one of those periods right now, but the idea of the last ice age is we were coming out of this, and as the Milankovitch cycles are bringing us into a warmer phase in relation to Earth's position and closeness to the sun, the idea had been that as all of the melt water is running off into the North Atlantic from the melting ice caps, that this cold water flushing into the Atlantic disrupts those thermohaline circulations that you're talking about, and this does lead to pockets of cold, especially in the northern hemispheres. And so that had been the general mechanism that geologists, paleogeologists had, paleogeologists, the one that they had looked at in terms of trying to explain what was happening with the Younger Dryas. But the peculiar presence of what appear to be impact proxies is part of what has led many researchers to begin to ask questions about another causal factor. Now, this was first proposed by a couple of guys, Firestone and Topping, Richard Firestone and William Topping, in an article, I believe, that appeared in Mammoth Trumpet, the archaeological journal, a number of decades ago. I remember reading this when I was maybe in my late teens or early 20s, but the gist of it was they had believed that there was a cosmic event, but I think at that time Topping and Firestone were proposing something more along the lines of a supernova. In fact, some researchers, including Robert Schoch that I mentioned earlier, he still maintains resolutely that it was a supernova and that this impact hypothesis is all rubbish. Well, I love Bob Schoch. I've known Schoch for years. He and I have traveled together to some Mesoamerican sites, but I do disagree with Bob on that point respectfully. And, you know, friends and colleagues can do that from time to time. It's okay not to agree on everything, but I'm looking at the accumulation of evidence in the form of these impact proxies, and what those are and what that means is particularly the abundance of platinum in sedentary features in the stratigraphy that is coincident with the Younger Dryas boundary, or YDB as it is often referred to. Why is platinum of significance? This, by the way, Don, has also been found in ice cores that have been drilled from Greenland and from other locations around the world, basically on every continent now. They found this so-called platinum anomaly, which was readily identified, and some of the groundbreaking work in identification of this platinum anomaly was done by my dear friend, Dr. Christopher Moore, who is a geoarchaeologist in South Carolina. In fact, he actually recently just published the site report, a paper on the White Pond Dig site, which my friends, the Seven Ages Research Associates and I, it's Jason Pentrail, James Waldo, and me. I can tell you more about those guys a little later, but we are a group of researchers who lend our muscle, basically, and we try to help our archaeologist friends, but we also do a lot of independent research as well as avocationalists, dedicated amateurs ourselves, although James is actually a Army Corps of Engineer, actual professional geologist, and then Jason Pentrail actually has a background in environmental science, so they're far more qualified than I am. I'm just a motor mouth who reads a lot. But the platinum anomaly was identified there at the White Pond site, where we have volunteered with Dr. Moore, who leads that site excavation. Now, Dr. Moore has helped to identify this platinum anomaly, and why it's significant is because that is a rare earth element. It is not a element that is abundant on Earth naturally, and so when you find a widespread dispersal of it in a high concentration, like what we find at the Younger Dryas boundary, that seems to indicate that there was an extraterrestrial source for that rare earth element, and it isn't the only one that has been found. Other impact proxies also include what are called microspherules. There have also been melt glass, basically tektites, that are believed to also be formations that are, again, if you think about like glass that is formed by sand being struck, heated, and then cooled and melt, or after being melted to glass formation, it actually cools so quickly that it forms little glacious nodules that can be found. And you find these all over the world, but these are...
Well, as a matter of fact, King Tutankhamun.
Yes.
His necklace that he wore around his chest, if I'm not mistaken, had some of that glass in there, a yellow glass that came from one of those strikes.
You are not mistaken. That is correct. That's absolutely correct. It was something that was widely revered in the ancient world for its rarity.
My wife always wonders, where do you store this crap?
Right. Well, and I know we got a break coming up here, but again, with these impact proxies and with the abundance of evidence, including, which I'm sure we'll talk a little bit later about this, the Hiawatha Crater, which you referenced there in Greenville, that's further south of me, Greenland, different place. What this seems to indicate to us is that there is mounting evidence that supports the idea of a cometary fragment that might have split into several pieces rather than simply being impacts. It's very likely, Don, that there were probably a lot of air bursts as well, which would not have actually required an impact to account for a lot of these phenomena.
Well, about roughly 10 or 12 years ago, on one of the channels, I have satellite television. It had to be the Science Channel. I watched an hour-long documentary where a number of geologists and other scientific talent was trying to discover what in the world happened to not only the Clovis people, but the megafauna that absolutely filled up North America. And if you're not sure what I mean by megafauna, the great woolly mammoth, mastodon, saber-toothed cats, short-faced cave bears, which incidentally would make a grizzly bear look like a kitten,
yeah,
giant diurnal wolves, giant ground sloths, etc. Now, if you, and you shouldn't, but if you doubt any of that, come down to Los Angeles when the pandemic is over and take a trip downtown to the La Brea tar pits and see what in the heck they've been dragging out of there for decades. It'll blow your mind. But with that being said, one of the things they discovered were these microsphericals and diamonds that were, you have to look at them through a microscope. They're so small, but can only be created by, what you were just referring, Micah, an airburst, almost like a nuclear weapon going off. It is actually, it's humbling if you think about it.
Oh, absolutely. Yeah, the nanodiamonds. I'm well familiar with what you're describing there. And again, these are things that have been identified going all the way back to Firestone and Topping. They were trying to account for what mechanism would have caused their formation. But again...
Right. And hold that thought.
Yes.
I just looked at my clock. I don't want my producer to slap me around. We're at the top of the hour. Ladies and gentlemen, this is Dark Matters Radio. My very special guest tonight, and it's great to have him back, Mr. Micah Hanks. We'll be back after these words.
Why is it we're not very good with our health regimen until it's too late? We don't put oil in the car until the engine blows up. When the body's out of balance, your health is not so good. Give your body some love. Log on to GetTheT.com. That's GetTheT.com. Try our Life Change Tea, which cleanses you from harmful intruders. A clean colon is one of the ways to bring the body in balance. We also carry organic supplements to help you get where you need to go. So do your body a favor. Log on to GetTheT.com. That's GetTheT.com. You can even visit our sales page to save some dough. Does anybody call money dough anymore? Anyway, if you're looking for short, helpful health tips, go to YouTube and punch in Health Matters Now. That's Health Matters Now. So, log on to GetTheT.com, shop, get balanced, then learn some cool tips at Health Matters Now. You'll be glad you did. That's GetTheT.com.
For the thousands of wounded warriors returning from battle, Wounded Warrior Project has developed the Warriors to Work program, a career counseling service that helps wounded warriors translate their military experience to a civilian job. These extraordinary men and women bring more than just teamwork and inspiration to the workplace. They bring proven world-class job skills. And to ensure proper placement, Wounded Warrior Project works with employers to find just the right job fit. Talented, skilled, and eager to get back to work, you have the opportunity to hire a seasoned veteran. Contact Wounded Warrior Project at findwwp.org. Welcome home the brave.
So, you love talk radio? Then you'll love TalkStreamLive.com. TalkStream Live is always on, 24/7 with the best streaming talk shows. Find your favorite talkers and discover some new ones. It's free, readily available online or on mobile with any smartphone or tablet. Finding your favorite talk shows all in one place has gotten a whole lot easier. Just go to TalkStreamLive.com. Be sure to download the free apps from Google Play or the iTunes App Store.
Are you intrigued by Paranormal Talk Radio? You'll love the new Paranormal Radio app from TalkStream Live. You'll find a great selection of talk shows covering UFOs, ghosts, strange phenomena, and much more. Download the Paranormal Radio app now and start listening to the very best in paranormal talk entertainment, including the network you're listening to right now, the Paranormal Radio app. Free in Google Play and the iOS App Store.
You listen to us, and we listen to you. And so does the CIA. KGRARadio.com.
And we are back with hour number 2 with Micah Hanks. Micah, when we were just creeping up to the top of the hour, you were in the middle of a thought. Would you like to finish it now?
Well, certainly, and that was merely piggybacking on something that you were pointing out. You had been talking about those nanodiamonds.
Right.
Right, yeah, and these are among the what are called impact proxies. The reason that we have to rely on impact proxies, and the reason that they're named such, is because for the longest time there has been no clear evidence of a impact feature that normally one would associate with an impact event. Now, if we think about, for instance, the Cretaceous, tertiary boundary, which we associate with the extinction of the dinosaurs and the like, and the Alvarez father and son team that identified this back a number of decades ago, we actually believe that the Chicxulub crater is representative of this. Essentially, that a portion of the Gulf of Mexico represents this massive crater from an impact event. Boy, that was a really bad day in Earth history. And unfortunately, our scaly friends, the dinosaurs, didn't quite make it through it. But what's really...
No, but we did. And if it wouldn't have been for that, there's a big question whether we'd even be around now.
Right. Yeah, we did manage. Well, first of all, mammalian forms on planet Earth at that time, the smaller ones actually fared better. They didn't have to take in as much food, and with probably the massive climate changes, biomass burning, possible volcanism, all kinds of other issues that might have been the after effects of an impact event like that. Possible nuclear winter as ejecta is thrust up into the atmosphere, and it actually blankets the upper atmosphere, shielding the Earth from the sun, and causes cooling temperatures that are untenable for large reptilian creatures. Those that weren't killed in conjunction with the impact were killed thereafter as a result of the changes in the environment that occurred, resulting as after effects. So yes, small mammalian life forms were able to thrive, and of course, over a long period of time, this gives rise to all the life that we know on Earth today that have managed to persist, and certain other animal life forms like alligators and crocodiles, certain kinds of fish like the coelacanth that
birds.
Many birds, which again many would say are actually more closely related to dinosaurs, even than a lot of extant reptiles. But yeah. A lot of species, smaller species, did persist. They did thrive. As you can see, and this is something you were alluding to before we went to the break, megafaunal species, larger animals, do not fare well when you have a massive cosmic event along these lines. And talking with Dr. James Kennett, who is a paleogeologist and also one of the lead researchers in what is known as the Comet Research Group, which is looking at this Younger Dryas impact hypothesis. I spoke to Dr. Kennett a couple of years ago with my colleague Jason Pentrail. We spoke for a couple of hours with him. This wasn't for air. This was just colleagues speaking on the telephone and sharing insights. And he was doing all the sharing. We were doing all the listening. James Kennett is just a giant in this field. But again, he had said the Younger Dryas impact event would have been a pipsqueak compared to what killed the dinosaurs. And yet, this many are now looking to as being a causal agent that leads to megafaunal die-offs, or at very least it was a factor contributing to megafaunal die-offs. This contributes to a number of other things. And talking with Andrew Moore yesterday, again, who is, I believe his actual title now is honorary president, being a past president of the Archaeological Institute of America. But Dr. Moore, who was the lead author on this recent paper in Scientific Reports on the Abu Huraira site in Syria, He says, look, here's the bottom line. This Younger Dryas impact event was incredibly significant, and it very well may have caused changes great enough in the world and also the food supply that it actually pushed us in the direction of agriculture. Now think about that. One of the most significant developments in the history of human civilization, and it very well may be that this Younger Dryas event was a direct factor that leads humans, pushes us to have to get through this. And so I asked Dr. Moore, I said, listen, in light of things that are going on right now, in light of all of the concerns we have about coronavirus, and, again, I know I'm kind of like you, Don, a lot of us are sort of tired of seeing nothing but that news, but we do recognize the concern. But I asked him, I said, does it not speak to the human resilience in times of great change and even cataclysm that we respond, humans, to a impact event by creating a science of agriculture so that we can produce food where food may have been scarce for periods and where there may not have been the large megafaunal animals that had been the preferential food source up until that time? Isn't it fascinating that humans, in the words of Dr. Ian Malcolm, always he said life finds a way, but we do. We always press on. We always find a way through these hardships. And he says, yeah, that is a good corollary, although in light of what we know about the Younger Dryas impact event, it may not be a fair comparison. The coronavirus, comparatively as dangerous as it can be, it's probably small fish in a big pond compared to the Younger Dryas. So, this was a tremendous period of change in the ancient world.
Well, I'm still holding out for the other shoe to drop, Micah. The zombie apocalypse immediately following coronavirus. But that hasn't happened yet. But I did want to mention this. Some of the elements of apparently what transpired right at the apex of Younger Dryas. My father was, in many ways, much like me. He was a lover of history. And my mom's dad's older brother, my uncle, great uncle, I should say, died about 1958 or 59. Now, the reason I mention this, he had been a subscriber to National Geographic going back to the time he was probably 20 years old. Now, when my dad discovered that, he went to my uncle's widow and bought all of those National Geographics for $5 and brought them home. And boy, I'll tell you what, I was just a young kid then, but I dove into those like you would not believe, because they went back. There was actually even the edition when King Tut's tomb was discovered. Okay, I had that actual magazine with all the original photographs of them bringing the artifacts out of Tutankhamun's tomb. Now, in one of those National Geographics, there was a big picture story about some Siberian hunters in Siberia at that point. Now remember, Siberia then was part of the Union of Soviet Socialist Republics. And the guy in charge was Joseph Stalin, a first-class son of a bitch, no getting around it. But they allowed these guys to go in and take photographs. What these Siberian hunters had found were giant boneyards of vast herds of woolly mammoths that something seemingly had picked up like the hand of God and threw them with incredible force, literally smashing these animals into pieces. Now, in the story, later, they came out that it would have had to have been winds of 1,000 miles an hour per se, 1,000 miles an hour, which would pick up anything and just tear it apart. and it came from that time period. So, yeah, I'm sure glad I wasn't around then, because that would have undoubtedly screwed up the weekend, Micah.
Would have been a very bad day here on planet Earth. And, I've heard similar reports of, areas that show evidence of mass destruction. It's kind of incredible if you think about it. When we look at sites, again, like the one I referenced, Abu Huraira there in Syria, but we also look at sites in other parts of the world. We are looking at evidence where there were thatched huts and things, and they were building fires, and they were living alongside, a major waterway, and also there's a readily available food source because of the reindeer or the variety of fauna, apart from that even, that are moving through this area, and they are, of course, able to easily go in there. They can live close by, but they can hunt. There's a lithic stone source, a quarry that they can utilize for various tools nearby. And so you've got this kind of watering hole feature in the sense that all of the elements that you need are there and present. And then all of a sudden something happens that is capable of causing widespread biomass burning, capable of melting sand and almost instantaneously fusing it into those tektite, those natural glass formations we're talking about. And again, there are a number of, I believe it's called, there's a tech, I've probably got my notes here somewhere. I would have to look it up. But again, there is a technique that they utilize that is able to measure the magnetic properties of these tektites, and they are able to determine essentially, also they put them in ovens. They actually take some of the samples and have put them in ovens and see what the melting points are. And they were able to determine that the conditions under which a tektite can be formed by a lightning strike under similar conditions do not match those of the ones that are found at sites like Abu Huraira. So quite obviously, we are looking at something that we can rule out lightning strikes, which is the only other known, well, I shouldn't say the only other known, but the only one that would produce similar melt glass formations comparable to this. There are other mechanisms. For instance, some have said that volcanism might account for this, but as Dr. Moore had said when we spoke with him, to try and say that there was a volcanic activity of that magnitude that was occurring near Syria at that time, well, there's no evidence of that, and therefore we can probably rule that one out. But again, the only explanation appears to be an impact or an airburst or a combination of the two that widespread effects around the globe resulted from. And so, again, yeah, bad day on planet Earth is an understatement. I mean, we're talking about something that wipes out all the megafauna. Even if it is the pipsqueak, as James Kennett told me, compared to the one that killed the dinosaurs, it may not have killed all the megafauna at once. And I think that is a misinterpretation of the data. Many skeptics have attacked the idea that all the megafauna died. We know on, I believe, Wrangel Island, up until around 3,000 or 4,000 years ago, there was at least a small population of mammoths extant. So they didn't all die all at once.
Pygmy mammoths.
Smaller ones, right, yeah, and which is not uncommon on a island environment. I'll tell you just a quick anecdote. I've spent a lot of time down on Dolfusky Island off the coast of South Carolina, and the white-tailed deer on that island are much smaller comparatively to the ones that you find on the mainland. So on an island environment like that, that's probably not going to be surprising, but nonetheless, probably due to their smaller size, that could have something to do with how they were able to thrive. A smaller animal doesn't have to eat as much and can withstand living alongside one another in a small population on an environment where, or an island environment where you're going to have limited flora and food sources. So it's not surprising, but again, I definitely think it is safe to say that the Younger Dryas impact event, if an impact event indeed it were, contributed to the chain of events that led to widespread mammoth and other megafaunal die-offs.
Right. And I gotta ask you, Micah, if you've ever considered what it was that finally killed those animals that were basically leftovers from that event on that island, even though they shrunk in size, and so forth. What do you think finally did them in 3,000 or 4,000 years ago?
I couldn't give you a conclusive answer. I'm not an expert on this, but I will cite the work of a very interesting gentleman who I spoke with recently by the name of Ryan Gill. Ryan Gill has a YouTube channel where he demonstrates a lot of ancient tools and weapons, and he is essentially a flint napper. Don, have you ever tried your hand at flint napping?
No, sir, I have not. I prefer my hunting knife. Thank you.
That's right. Yeah. I've got a K-bar over there in the next room that I prefer to carry on my hip when I'm in the woods as well. But the flint nappers were very adept at finding good, lithic quarries and harvesting this stone. A really good stone that you would want to use would be like a chert, something along those lines, because it flakes. I think it's called conchoidal fracturing, if memory serves. But basically, for those at home, if you've ever seen where a BB gun strikes a piece of glass and it leaves that sort of round, that circular impression, same sort of thing. Chert, as you're napping it, it tends to flake in a very similar way and leaves those same sort of conchoidal fracture patterns. But I digress. Anyway, the ancient flint nappers were really good with this stuff, and so is Ryan Gill. He is a real expert, but he has actually engaged in studies in controlled settings and also in conjunction with, basically, he is not a member of, and the studies weren't funded by, but he has provided data to Texas A&M University, I believe, and with an interest in trying to see exactly how ancient tools might have been utilized for carving and also for primitive hunting. What he has found is that through experimentation, and he and other archaeologists who are interested in this sort of study, they have found that larger animals like bison antiquus, megafaunal bison, things along those lines, much like modern buffalo, they probably wouldn't have scared very easily. They're a large target, so they're comparatively easy to hit compared to a rabbit or a white-tailed deer. Ancient hunters were absolutely going after the largest animal, which yields more protein. You get more bang for the buck, in other words, but they also aren't likely to run by virtue of being herding animals. They don't scare easily, and so you've got this kind of perfect storm. Very interestingly, that's all basically based on observations that Ryan has done as an expert tool maker in the Paleo-Indian and archaic Native American style. But speaking with Dr. Chris Moore, who's the very same geoarchaeologist who has done the platinum anomaly analyses and has helped to identify this at numerous sites around the world, Dr. Moore has pointed out to us that utilizing a process called blood protein analysis, we can actually find remnant varieties of plasmas and blood that are left on these ancient lithic fragments even after the passing of thousands of years. And they almost all show the same thing, that they were used to hunt bison antiquus, megafaunal bison. So quite obviously, I think that after the Dryas and the sorts of changes that are occurring in the environmental change that gives rise to changes in the food supply, changes in the temperature, and all of these sorts of conditions that are going to be unfavorable to large megafaunal species, you have to also add to that humans doing what humans do. They're looking for food. They're going to hunt what's available, and they clearly showed a preference. All the evidence points toward larger megafaunal animals. Not only bison, we also have, of course, mammoth kill sites at locations like Murray Springs and others throughout the United States. Quite obviously, humans were opportunistic hunters who took advantage of what would give them the greatest protein yield with the least amount of work. People are lazy. That's it. It was the same way back then, even though they had to work a lot harder than we do today. They'd take an easy, hit if they could. And these things quite obviously contributed to the death of the megafaunal species. Now, there is a theory in archaeology that is called the overkill hypothesis, that human populations were entirely responsible for the death of megafauna. But now the problem is that the data that we're talking about that I've already outlined does not seem to correlate as well for dire wolves, for the short-faced bear, for the American lion, the American...
You did it again, Micah. I was going to mention, well, yeah. I'll let you go ahead and finish, but I was going to mention something, but please proceed.
Well, that's all I'm saying is that, again, we don't see a whole lot of archaeological evidence. It's not to say that none exists. We definitely know that ancient human populations hunted ground sloths, a lot of gomphotheres, which were kind of a weird kind of a mix between a mammoth and a giant anteater. They obviously hunted whatever they could, but they don't seem to show quite the same preference, especially for those predatory animals like dire wolves, large megafaunal cat varieties and things along those lines. So to say that the overkill hypothesis accounts for all of these animals and their deaths, I don't know that that necessarily is the best explanation, but if it is part of the issue in conjunction with environmental changes that were occurring, that seems to be a more complete picture and a better answer to the broader spectrum of phenomena we're talking about.
Well, what I was going to say, when I was in school, that was a question that I'm absolutely positive that popped up in my mind at various points, that academia then was teaching that human predation was the reason all these megafauna disappeared. Okay. They wiped out the bison. They wiped out the mastodons. They wiped out the woolly mammoths and all of that basically because they were too good at what they were doing, hunting. Well, what these eggheads did not take into consideration were that these people, okay, these early human beings basically knew the environment. They knew their environment. They knew what they needed for their families, the offspring, their descendants. They would have never killed like the American Indian. They never would have killed these animals to the last lonely herd. That was unheard of. That I'm sure they would not have even thought about that. And the hubris of academia always never managed or never ceased to manage to cause me to wonder where their common sense was.
Well, many would argue that there's no evidence for instance, the idea that herding or that there was domestication of animals in Paleo-Indian America, many would say, well, there's no evidence of that. Interestingly, in South America, there have been some sites. Interestingly, it was a cave in South America that seemed to show evidence based on the accumulation of animal feces. And this is a remarkable thing because where you've got megafaunal animal species, in this case, a giant ground sloth, it can often tell you an awful lot about an environment and about changes and things that were happening in the world around that time. Because, of course, where you've got a lot of mammoth dung, for instance, you know that mammoths were not only congregating, but there are certain kinds of pollen spores and different kinds of fungi that are present there. And these little things can tell us an awful lot about what was going on in the ancient world. It just goes to show one man's trash is another man's treasure. In this case, I guess it's more one man's megafaunal dung is another man's treasure, tells archaeologists an awful lot. But yes, in this cave in South America, the accumulation of giant ground sloth dung in the particular region in the back of this particular cave strongly suggested that these animals had been kind of corralled back there, which makes all the sense in the world. Yet again, there's this strange attitude, Don, that in the ancient world, people certainly wouldn't have figured these things out. They couldn't have been doing those things like we do today. They're not us. They didn't think like we do. Look, evolutionarily speaking, we're talking about modern Homo sapiens sapiens. I mean, they were no different from us in essence.
The only real difference is some of us have Androids and others have iPhones.
I was going to say the only real difference is that they didn't have social media, and I bet they were a whole lot better for it. Yeah. So, but yeah, these people in the ancient world, they did an awful lot that we could do. They, I'm sure, utilized watercraft. They probably did engage in, at very least, certain limited corralling of or manipulation of, possibly even domestication of certain animal species. In Paleolithic Europe, we do have some evidence that ancient humans might have actually been capable of riding horses and domesticating horses. And I'll tell you what's really compelling. Again, I'd have to see more data on this before we can say it's a likelihood per se, but there is at least some evidence that suggests that even the enigmatic Denisovans might have also domesticated horses, or at very least had a very close relationship with them, which is compelling to say the least.
Oh, yeah. A lot of people are not aware that horses were here millennia before the Spanish brought them back, and camels also. Mm-hmm. But here, I'm going to throw a mystery at you. And I've read everything I could get my hands on concerning this particular issue, Micah. And nobody apparently agrees on anything concerning domestic dogs. Where in the heck did dogs come from? Now, my wife and I we currently have 2 dogs. We have a Cocker Spaniel, and we have a Sheltie. And but prior to those dogs, we had a massive animal by the name of Buckwheat, who was basically a combination of Chinese Shar Pei, Labrador Retriever, and German Shepherd. Now, this dog in his prime hit 125 pounds. And his nature, he was the sweetest animal you could ever hope to meet. He was big, he was intimidating from that aspect, but he was just an absolutely lovable, big lug rather. And my wife doted on him. But I got to tell you, on several instances, I saw the wolf come out of this dog.
Oh, yeah.
we were out shopping one day, and we pulled into our house, the driveway beside our house. And my wife, Vicky, got out, and she went up through the gate into the back of the house. Buckwheat was out in the yard, and I was parking, not really paying attention. Suddenly, I heard my wife shriek, and I jumped out of the car, and I saw Buckwheat, a rabbit, had gotten in our yard, which was sad news for the rabbit. That dog grabbed him, snapped him in 2, and threw the remains at least 30 feet in the air. And I wouldn't have believed it if I had not seen it. Okay. And here was this dog that everybody absolutely loved. If they could have seen that, they would have been shocked to the very bottom of their feet. Now, dogs, I think everybody will agree, at one time, their ancestors were wolves. But yet, today, Micah, if we get a wolf pup and try to raise that animal as a domestic dog, you are playing with a live hand grenade. Okay?
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
The wolf can turn on a dime, but yet dogs, for the most part, don't. Now, there's a subtle difference. Now, when I said I've read everything, I have. Everything I could find on the domestication of dogs. Some people said it happened 40,000 years ago. Others suggested, if I'm not mistaken, 25 or 20,000 years ago. Well, the bottom line is nobody the hell knows, okay? But I also read a report that came out of Canada that suggested, now this, it's going to get a little woo-woo, that some intelligence did some gene splicing and DNA manipulation, and voila, we now have the domesticated dog. What do you think about any of that?
Well, I think it's a really interesting topic for conversation, first and foremost. And it is interesting. I want to point something out here right at the outset. It's fascinating to me, the evolutionary, how do we want to term this? Well, it is essentially, I guess, a sort of almost homeostasis, where humans and dogs are comfortable living alongside one another to the point that humans are capable of communicating more efficiently in many ways with our canine kindred than we are with other primates. A quick example. If I point, most dogs are capable of understanding what pointing means, and it not necessarily if they are trained to do it, although of course training always helps. Most dogs have to be trained. You got to train them to go outside, if they've got to go. So you house train the dog, you train the dog to sit, and if you reinforce that behavior with the treat and then gradually wean them off of that so that they know that if I say sit, you sit. And then, Alpo or whatever, sits, and he's a good dog. He knows when he's making his master happy. Animals can be trained to do these things, but fundamentally, A dog can recognize if I point, and especially with a little help of training, if you point, they know what that means, and they will look and they will follow what direction your finger's going, whereas chimpanzees have no idea what that means. You might be able to train them to understand, but again, they don't seem to have the innate capacity that dogs do. Now, why is that the case? It's not necessarily because dogs are smarter than chimpanzees. It is that dogs have had a relationship with humans over the course of thousands and thousands of years that has not only helped them to survive, but has helped us to survive. And so again, I can't help but think about the idea of homeostasis. We think about the clownfish that lives within the sea anemone, right? The anemone provides the clownfish protection, and the anemone, or rather, I guess the clownfish attracts. Well, I'm not even going to pretend like I'm an expert on what the homeostatic relationship is there. But again, we see this often in not only aquatic environments, we see it on land too. But again, if we look at that corollary there, how the anemone and the clownfish have benefits from being able to maintain this sort of relationship with one another, we see that humans and dogs have similar relationships. We, of course, can rely on a dog because of its sense of smell and its capability of being able to hunt and to be able to find, for instance, quarry. If there's that rabbit, like you mentioned, you talk about the modern dog going nuts when it sees a rabbit and chasing that small game. Well, again, ancient humans recognized this. We also saw that. And again, if we were to kind of put this into the context of, an ancient narrative, let's say that, you and I are sitting there, Don and Micah, Paleo Don and Paleo Micah, and we're sitting there by a fire somewhere in ancient Germany around 14,000 years ago, and we're burning, meat, or we're cooking it over a fire, probably more akin to burning it. But, wolves smell that, and they come near the fire, and they aren't going to approach, they aren't going to get really close. But I'm sure ancient humans began to realize that these animals were drawn to that scent. And those animals probably would also see that if we follow these humans and we kind of stay close to them, we can pick up the scraps as they're moving from site to site and they go on the hunt the next day. Whatever they leave behind, we're going to go in behind them and clean house. As we see how adept they are at hunting, and they, over time, learn gradually that, well, if we follow these guys, there's always going to be some food on hand. It's not hard to see how in the ancient world humans might have started saying, look, let's befriend these guys, Let's see how far this goes. They gradually.
Yeah, but they were still wolves, Micah. They were still wolves.
They were, but now if you get a baby wolf and you bring it up around humans, it's still going to be a wolf, but it's going to not be necessarily as feral, having grown up around humans. That seems to be one of the significant points that makes the leap over into domestication. And the earliest evidence of a domestic dog, I think, is about 14,000 years ago in Germany, but there were separate different domestication events that were occurring at one time. In Germany, we also had them in Asia occurring a little more recently. But again, at some point, this is fascinating to speculate about. At what point did they discover, baby wolf pups or something? Had there been an actual wolf, a mother that was killed, and the pups were taken, and they say, hey, let's just see what happens. What actually sparks the domestication event is still an item of speculation against, among anthropologists. Now, as far as the alien idea or the genetic manipulation.
Now, I did not say alien.
Oh, I did, didn't I? Again, that would be going further than I feel like we need to. And I'm glad you point that out, by the way, because that is a stereotype that we have to deal with so much in UFOs. I shouldn't bring it over into anthropology, but again, for me, we don't need that as an explanatory mechanism to understand how that domestication would have occurred in the ancient world. To me, it seems more likely that humans gradually over time began to coexist alongside certain groups of wolves, dangerous though that would have been because, like you say, they were wolves. Or perhaps the domestication occurred with infants, young wolves, pups. But however it happened, we know it happened. We know that then, now here's the thing. You're absolutely not wrong to bring up the idea of genetic manipulation and the idea of different canine species being genetically engineered, I'm going to say, because we did the same thing with agriculture. We did the same thing with food stuff. We grow different strains, different groups, different crops, which aid us in growing them larger and growing more of them so that more people can be fed. Very similarly, interbreeding between species leads to dog species like we know today. And that was absolutely a process of human manipulation. So it's absolutely not incorrect to say that genetic manipulation played a role, but that would have taken place over a long period of time and gives rise to the modern dogs that we know.
Well, I was gonna go on a ledge again, okay,
sure,
concerning that. But when I said manipulation, okay, now, of course, the idea is still a rich idea among many people that follow this field of unidentified flying objects, that type of thing, of extraterrestrial intervention. But let's get a little closer to home. We still do not know with any certainty how old the human race is, Homo sapiens sapien, okay? There are a lot of people that will say 200,000 years. There are a lot of people that will say 300,000 years. And there are a few people that will go so far as to say perhaps close to 1,000,000 years Homo sapiens sapien has been around. Now, I have no idea. I would be prone to be much more conservative. But with that being said, Homo sapiens sapien, as you very correctly pointed out, are exactly the same as you and I without technology. All right? We have electricity. I'm sure they could not have even dreamed of something like that. We have steel. We have iron. They didn't. They had stones. But in every other respect, they were us. Now, with that being said, what if there was a group or groups of them several 100,000 years ago, I'm going to be conservative, that banded together, created a civilization, and began to rise? How long did it take us today to go from candle power, Micah, to nuclear power? Or to go from horsepower to the steam engine, or to go from agriculture to the industrial age, or from dreaming about flying to flying to the freaking moon? How long?
You know, we could actually probably argue that although it really was a cumulative effort and it occurs within the course of a couple of hundred years, really, we could nonetheless say that the major achievements occur over the course of decades. Would you disagree?
No, I would not.
Yeah, and that's something that really fascinates me because, again,
well, my point is, if there was a human civilization, oh, hell, let's not even go 200,000 years. Let's go 75,000 years ago. That rose to perhaps at least our level. And they knew something bad was on the horizon. They went, for example, underground, or who knows, perhaps even off planet, but then ended up coming back. Now, I realize this is the purest speculation, but what if, Micah? What if?
Right. Well, I like this kind of speculation because this gets us into the realm of theories of origin of the UFO phenomenon, right? It is interesting that, and to make this kind of segue, if we go back to 1947, it was almost kind of taken as a foregone conclusion that, well, things are seen in the sky. These are aircraft that, you know, are far, far beyond our capabilities. Those, or presumably those of our, you know, preeminent threat in the East at that time after the Second World War, which of course was Stalin's Russia, so the Soviet Union. And so what we look at as UFOs, we almost immediately conclude could be nothing but extraterrestrial. And again, as you have written about and talked about for years, and as I have done as well, the idea of a estimate of the situation that's conducted under Project Sign seeks to address this. And, you know, the top brass didn't like their conclusion that this seems to be extraterrestrial. And so they say, don't come back at us with that junk again. Don't you do it. And so the Air Force kind of begins, talk about a truth embargo, to borrow that expression that Stephen.
Oh, yeah.
But I mean, that's really when we start seeing not so much a truth embargo in the sense that government is hiding what they know, but in the absence of knowing anything, apparently, apart from, the UFO book or the UFO reports that were being logged under Project Blue Book. And I should mention here, of course, that in order to establish the continuity, we had Blue Book, but there was also that Project Grudge in the middle, so I'm not forgetting it. But the idea, though, that we had presumed that this was extraterrestrial only went so far. By the late 1960s, a lot of theorists and researchers, and many of them, I mean, again, scientists like Jacques Vallée and others, had begun to say, look, maybe we have leapt to certain conclusions here. I recall Alan Hendry, who had worked under J. Allen Hynek there at the Center for UFO Studies back in the 1970s, talking about the fact that at an event in Chicago, participants at a conference, presumably in the late 1970s, had been asked, what do you think UFOs are? Most participants said they thought that they were extraterrestrial. Some said that they thought that they were something from another dimension or something along those lines. Some didn't give an answer, and others said that they thought a civilization here on Earth. Now, coming back to your point, speculative though that is, some have argued that, look, is there some way that our own technology could account, or at very least a human presence could account for the UFO phenomena? And there are, speculative though they are, there are a variety of ways we can interpret that problem. Many gravitate toward the idea of time travel. Well, what if the UFO phenomena represents us, but us from the future interacting with us, you and I, in the present day? What if it were a crypto-terrestrial civilization that somehow has existed in our midst, but is unknown to the broader, group of humanity as we know it? What if they had been from the past, and that they had, like you said, left and come back, or something along those lines? What if it had been an earthly civilization that somehow remains hidden in our midst? There is the idea of an alternate reality parallel to our own. Again, so much of this is so far out there that it borders science fiction, and it had been Hendry's attitude at the time that they really do nothing in the furtherance of our knowledge about UFOs. Now, for my own part, Don, I think you'd agree, I enjoy that speculation because it allows us to exercise our mental muscles. But if we're going to talk about UFOs, really the best way, in my opinion, to approach it is to say we study the reports, we gather data, and we try actually not to leap to conclusions about what they may or may not be. And so I'm happy to kind of operate in both of those paradigms where I say I don't leap to a conclusion with speculation about what UFOs might be, but again, we try to account for what they could be, and the extraterrestrial attitude maybe should not be treated as that foregone conclusion that, well, this is the self-evident only explanation.
I could not agree more, Micah. I could not agree more.
Yeah, and there certainly could be other interpretations. So I think I'm following you there. I think I know where you're going with that, and it's an interesting bridge over from anthropology into ufology.
Well, like I said, the purest speculation, but the bottom line is, now I don't know how you feel about remote viewing. Okay?
I could tell you.
I'm sorry?
I said I could tell you, though.
Oh, sure, absolutely. Well, let me say this and then fire away.
You got
it. Back in the 90s, all right, now back when Jim Mars was still around, I was friends with Mars. As a matter of fact, along about, I guess it would have been 1997, 98, my wife and I were over in Vegas, and we were over to see Jim. He was up doing something up there. And at any rate, Jim and I, my wife wandered off. Jim and I ended up doing a tequila tour there.
No. Not you and ours.
And I got to tell you, that's a memory I'll carry with me to my dying day. And my God, was that guy funny. Oh, was he funny.
He was.
But at any rate, he was very much into the remote viewing thing. Now, this was not long after it became public knowledge. So I, over the years, had a chance to meet and, have intercourse with, and I don't mean that in a weird way.
I know what you mean.
Yeah, well, a lot of the audience may not. But I knew a lot of these guys, And, you know, I interviewed some of them. We had them in the magazine and so forth. So I got to tell you, I had a lot of respect for them. And I had the added benefit of being personal friends with Ingo Swann. Okay. So when somebody talks remote viewing, I do not in any way, shape, or form poo-poo it. I don't know what in the hell happens, but something definitely does. And for the DOD to keep financing it for 20 years, they had to be getting some kind of value out of it, okay? Now, one of those guys, okay, had been in touch, and I forget now who the hell it is. I've got some stuff here from him, and it's been a long time since I thought about it. But this guy had done some remote viewing on hidden, quote unquote, extraterrestrial bases. Okay. Now, ET, who knows, maybe. Something else, who knows, maybe. But there were, according to this remote viewing readout, a total of, I believe, 4 of these underground whatevers right here on planet Earth. A number of them in the deep, deep ocean, and others in the deep, deep mountains. Now, is that real? Is it true? Well, Micah, who the hell knows? But it was very interesting. And if you were here from there, or you had been here forever and you wanted to, you know, evade the current inhabitants, this would have been the place to go. Do I discount that? Absolutely not. Not without proof. So there you go. Make of it what you will.
Yeah. Is it necessarily crazy to presume that, again, you know, oceanic or you know, mountainous regions would be inhabited? I mean, again, if you're going to look for an outpost, let's say that you are, whatever they are, we don't have to attribute some sort of a origin to the so-called UFO phenomenon. Let's say that you are anybody who is trying to remain hidden, and you've got a technological capability that helps you to do that. Of course, you're going to go to the most remote areas in order to facilitate remaining hidden. And so I don't think it's crazy what you're putting out there. Now, I want to share some Jim Marrs stories here too, because
yes, please.
At various times, I knew Jim pretty well too. He had come to Asheville a number of years ago, where I live, and had participated in a event which was being hosted by Joshua P. Warren, who used to live here. Now he lives out in Las Vegas. But Josh, Nick Redfern, and Jim Marrs came to town, and I remember Jim had been staying over there at Josh's house, and we went over there to Jim's, or rather to Josh's house. And, you know, Josh and I remember like a couple of kids were sitting there in the floor in his guest bedroom, and there's Jim Marrs, you know, getting ready for bed, and he's in his night clothes and everything. And he's sitting there at the edge of the bed, but still had his famous fedora on, right? And
he was bald. I think he was embarrassed about that.
Well, you know, but it was just, I love that hat. That hat just, you know, was his look, you know. And I remember Josh and I sitting there like a couple of school kids, you know, listening to him, just sitting Indian style on the floor, just listening to stories. And Jim's telling story after story after story. And then he's just kind of like at one point, "Boy, what time is it, fellas? I might have to get to bed here." And we realize it's about like 2:00 in the morning, you know, and we just lost track of time. But next day, you know, they were doing an event here in town, and I'd been coordinating a separate event over on the local community college here at University of North Carolina at Asheville. And so it was a busy weekend, and I reconvened with the guys that night, and I said, you know, "Jim, do you like Dos Equis beer?" And he says, "Yes, Mike, I believe I do." And so I brought a 12-pack of Dos Equis, and we enjoyed some cervezas. So for me, it wasn't tequila, but yeah, we definitely.
Cervezas go up to my cabazos.
Yes, indeed, señor. Sí, señor. Muy bien, muy bien. But it was well, now my Portuguese is wanting to come out. Muito fantástico. But anyway, we Redfern and Josh and Jim and I, we had quite a conversation. I even brought my Fender Telecaster over that night, and Jim loved to sing folk songs. He was quite a singer, and we did all kinds of bluegrass, country, all kinds of stuff. So we had and Jim or Nick Redfern hated it. Because, I mean, he always, has a great time, and he's the most delightful guy in the world. Nick, and, one of my favorite guys, but he doesn't like acoustic music. And so he never told me at that time that he had to listen to me and Mars yammering Uncle Pen and Bluegrass Boys cuts until 1 o'clock in the morning. He was a champ, and he kept his mouth quiet. But I found out that, he doesn't like, he liked the beer. He didn't like the music.
Well, I gotta tell you, Mars, of course, was a Texan. Okay.
Yeah. Oh, yeah. Uh-huh.
Now, since I've been a wee little boy, there was one part of Americana to this day, Micah, that has intrigued and fascinated me to the nth degree, and that is the Alamo.
Oh, yeah. Mm-hmm.
So Mars and I are sitting in this bar, downing shots of tequila, right?
Yeah.
And I've got some pictures of it too. But anyway, we're sitting in this bar, it's in a hotel or a casino. We're down in shots of tequila, and I mentioned the Alamo to him. So I'm telling him, I said, oh my golly, going back to Walt Disney and Fess Parker, Davy Crockett, oh boy, and and I'm really going on and on and on. He said, let me tell you a story, Don. And I said, yeah. He said, I was a reenactor. I said, you were? With what, the American Revolution or what? No. Texas War for Independence. So I'm thinking, Mars was Jim Bowie or something. He said, no, I was in the Mexican Army. and I said, you were in the Mexican Army? Oh, yeah, an artillery outfit. So they would have these reenactments. And here was Mars dressed up in his Santa Ana finest, right? With a damn artillery piece. Yeah. And he was telling me, he said, we'd load this thing. And then the gun commander would go, Fuego! Boom! And I'm cracking up. So we ended up finishing up the rest of the night. The girl would bring us over shots of tequila, and then it would either be Mars or me that would suddenly yell out, oh! And we both, now I got to admit, we were probably a little blasted.
No.
We both ended up getting these big Mexican black cigars. And of course you could smoke over there, right? So we fired up these cigars, and then Mars or I would go, Fuego! Boom! And we down the tequila and wait for the next round. Oh, God, he was a trip.
Yep, that's Jim Mars, all right. He was a trip, wasn't he? You know what? One of the last places I saw him, Don, I'll just add this, was the Aurora Cemetery down there in Aurora, Texas. The last place I saw him was actually at the Ozark Mountain UFO Conference. But, yeah, I actually ran into him down there at that cemetery. The famous alleged location of the burial of an airship pilot, which, that may be more myth than reality, but it was still an interesting story, and Jim knew a lot about it.
Oh, yeah, he did. As a matter of fact, Jim and I talked about that. Mm-hmm. And if I'm not forgetting, I think he had some kind of a to-do with Walt Andrus over that. Of course, MUFON pretty much claimed that whole thing for themselves. And, of course, the people in Aurora, so the story went, removed the tombstone and some other stuff so they wouldn't have all these touristas coming in there, and going through their cemetery. But, honest to God, Mike, I don't remember anymore what the deal was.
Right. I do know, though, that there was a weird little tombstone, or a stone at very least, that had an odd marking on it, this kind of trianguloid looking thing. Jim was the very one who showed me photographs of that, and he had real good quality photos too that he brought and he showed. I've probably got a photograph of him holding photographs of that at the Aurora Cemetery, but that stone certainly is not there any longer. There's a large kind of porous looking, almost scoria-like stone that rests at the location where they say that marker, that grave marker, had once been, and that's about the most that you'll see at the Aurora Cemetery. But there is a state historical marker there, an actual sign that shares the story of the alleged airship that crashed there in the 1890s. Now, I don't know what to make of that story, apart from the fact that, as we know, there was a wave of alleged sightings of airships in America at that time. And, some of those accounts are interesting, others not so much, but many researchers and historians who have looked at the UFO phenomenon more broadly do recognize that as a cultural predecessor to UFOs. We often think of UFOs as a modern phenomenon post-1947 or so. Quite evidently, that does seem to indicate that at very least, the natural human propensity to see things in the sky and attribute agency to them goes much earlier back. I couldn't tell you if there were actual airships and where they were from, but that is an interesting period in history, to say the least.
Well, they were also, believe it or not, those reports were happening in Europe right up to the beginning of the First World War in 1914.
Yeah, I recall Nick Pope writing about the quote-unquote scare ships. Yeah, and Lou Farish also. I'm sure you remember Lucius Farish.
Oh, sure.
Lou had written pretty extensively about those, the British airship wave. So really, there were periods in the 1890s, and then in the early 1900s, and then leading all the way up to 19. Well, at least in advance of the First World War, and possibly even coincident with it. But then, Pope has talked about the fact that, there were a lot of reports of airships where there shouldn't have been any all throughout that period. So it's kind of an interesting and a lot more complex issue than I think a lot of writers who look only at the American issue in the 1896, 1897 period would make it out to be.
Well, Micah, I've got a news flash for you, my friend. We have eaten up 2 full hours, and it just seems like we got started.
I know. How does it happen? I tell you, 2 good pals getting on the mic and talking, that's how it happens.
Well, yeah, and the fact that we managed to bring up some of these topics that are mind benders, okay? They just simply fascinate the public. Look, this has been fantastic. Once again, allow me to invite you back soon. What do you have on your plate happening right now?
Right now, unfortunately, in this era of social distancing, I'm kind of staying at home, which is allowing me to get caught up on a lot of projects. I am doing right now a historical sort of survey of UFO research, and I hope to produce some sort of a writing on that in the near future and some other stuff. But again, if people are interested in me and want to check me out, you can find all my info right there at micahhanks.com. That's my website. And I sincerely hope that we can get back on the mic. In fact, I got to get you back on my show sometime soon. So maybe we'll
I would love to come back. Look, that we've got to cut it off now. Ladies and gentlemen, that is it for tonight. We will be back tomorrow with Mark Center, Richard Saraday, and Open Lines. In the meantime, keep your social distance, wash your hands, and remember what I said at the beginning of the show. Turn off that damn coronavirus news crap. I'm sick of it. Sick of it, I tell you. And that's it until tomorrow. Thank you and good night. Micah, great time, buddy.
Thanks as always.